Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our panel discussion this evening. My name is Sanjana Nedugandhi. I use they and she pronouns, and I'm a social work intern with the New York City Anti-Violence Project. Today, we hope to honor the lived experiences of survivors and center the experiences of those most impacted. We're going to discuss divestment, which involves pulling resources away from policing and prisons, and also investment, which includes redirecting the majority of the massive police, prison, and military budgets at every level of this country to proven transformative initiatives. Before we start our discussion, we want to acknowledge the heaviness and the trauma that can come up when we are talking about state-sponsored and interpersonal violence, as well as justice. We encourage you to pause when needed and care for yourself. We also want to take a moment to acknowledge the murder of Daunte Wright. We send love and healing to his daughter, his girlfriend, his family, and his loved ones. Please join me in taking a moment of silence. Thank you so much. I will pass it to my co-moderator, Maisie Bright.
Thank you, Sanjana. Hi, everyone. My name is Maisie. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I work at the New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence, or NGBV, and will be co-moderating today with Sanjana. So just a little bit of how this event is going to go, what you should expect. I'm going to, or both Sanjana and I are going to ask two group questions. Then we're going to have one question for each panelist. Then we're going to take a Q&A from folks who are watching on YouTube. So if you have questions either for the group or any of the panelists in particular, please put those in the comment section. We're monitoring it, and we will be spending about 30 minutes doing that like public Q&A. So encourage you to submit those. And then we'll do one final group question all together. So I'm very excited to introduce our panelists that we have here with us today. Our two Californian panelists. Well, I don't know if you're originally Californian. I shouldn't assume that. Our two panelists who are representing California today are Patty Giggins, who is the CEO and Executive Director of Peace Over Violence, as well as the founder of Denim Day, and Tanish Hollins, the Executive Director of Californians for Safety and Justice, and the California State Director for Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. From New York, we have Erica Dixon, the Training Program Manager at the New York Anti-Violence Project, and Hema Sridharan, who is the Youth Empowered Consensuality Program Coordinator at Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center. Awesome. So I'm going to ask the first group question, and I ask that when whoever goes first, you say a little bit more about yourself, since I gave such a very, very brief introduction to each one of you. We'd love to hear more about your work, your role, who you are, what feels relevant to this moment. I also encourage folks to answer these questions, both as you yourself, as well as your professional role. It's okay if those answers maybe differ. It's okay if one feels more important or resonates more for you in this moment. So our first group question is, okay, I got it. Structural and interpersonal forms of violence impact people and communities, and violence impacts relationships with yourself, in your community, and your environment. How does your organization currently define and respond to violence? I am going to start randomly with Tanish. Thank you.
Well, that's a big question. First, I want to thank you all for inviting me to be a part of the panel. I am a native Californian. I'm from San Francisco. I'm a survivor. I'm honored to be leading this work here with Californians for Safety and Justice. And what we do is we work to shift policy here in California to reinvest from systems that have harmed our communities into solutions that really center survivors and center community well-being. That's the end game, that's the goal. That we no longer rely on systems that have failed us to give us safety or give us justice, but that we actually center the needs of the people and the voices of the people who have been most impacted by crime and violence. The question you asked is a big question. How do we define that? And there are lots of different ways. First and foremost, by crime, crimes that have impacted individuals and community. And then also structural violence that's waged on our communities. And we have living examples of it right now. How the trauma of being forced into systems that don't work specifically for people of color and marginalized communities. The structural violence and inherent racism that lives in many of the systems that we are forced to find safety and justice in. We're really working to shift that, not just as an organization, but as a community of people who are directly impacted, as survivors, as people who have also survived going through the criminal justice system. It's important that, in this definition and in this moment right now, that we really look at how we define safety and how we get there. And a big part of that work is around looking at safety as more than just the absence of crime and violence, but the presence of well-being. And that means preventing things from happening to our folks in the first place, but also really making sure that we're being responsive to the hurt and harm that survivors carry. We know that most crime goes unreported. Many people live in their communities and never get access to the resources or services that they deserve, especially when we talk about things like sexual assault, human trafficking, and other forms of violence. But the healing has to be coupled with accountability and justice. That's how we get to safety. So I want to leave from room. I think I heard someone else pop in. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you so much, Tanish. I thought that was a wonderful answer. I think the idea of centering definitions or like survivors being the ones that get to come up with those definitions is so key and makes so much sense. And the idea that safety is more than the absence of crime is something I hope to repeat. That is brilliant and also makes perfect sense. And there's so much more that safety like requires in order to exist, like access and resources and access to healing from hurt and harm, as you said. Thank you so much. Patty, can we have you go ahead next? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Patty Giggins from Peace Over Violence, She, Her, Hers. Yeah, this is a big question. I mean, I guess my my sense of it is informed by the fact that our organization has been around for 50 years. So we were we came into existence at around the same time when a lot of the rights movements were happening. Women's rights, gay rights, civil rights, disability rights. And so we were formed out of that period as an organization. And our focus has been throughout this time on sexual assault survivors, domestic violence, child abuse, and the prevention of youth violence. And to my mind, the structural, the interpersonal are intertwined. Part of the reason that we have, I believe, and I know I'm not alone in this belief in this room, that the reason we have as much interpersonal violence as we have is because of the structures and some of the cultural patterns that we have in our culture, in our society. And so they are kind of intertwined. And we've been trying to, unpack what this means, what violence means in our country. And it's such a powerful impediment to well-being that it really behooves us to look at prevention, to really look at prevention, as Tanish said, prevention in the first place, preventing harm in the first place, preventing harm from continuing through different structures and institutional practices. And so I think the way that I would answer the how do we deal with it? How do we engage is we've always had from the very beginning, had an empowerment approach where options and choices have been fundamental, where the voices of survivors have been central in developing even our programs at the agency, even the programs in the movement. And we've had lots of opportunities to try to work out how are we, they asked to the question, are we a movement, or are we an industry? Are we, what are we? Because we have developed organizations that do perform a lot of services and get government money. And so there's a lot of complications with that. But I think that for us, the basic thing is that we are survivor-centered, and we are trauma informed and resiliency focused in all of our practices. And that we over many years have tried to respond to the needs of survivors, their families, and their communities, and filling the voids when there were not services there, figuring out what we can do and how can we be there with them.
Thank you, Patty. I'm later in this conversation eager to hear more about that 50-year history and how it's evolved. But peace over violence has so much like knowledge and experience and has changed. And so it's really great to hear you sort of begin to talk about that as well. And I think the point around safety being, again, something that's defined by the choice and the options of the survivor themselves is a really important thing to reiterate and focus on. Thank you. All right. Yes, Erica, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'm Erica. I use they, she pronouns. I'm the training programs manager at the New York City AntiViolence Project. And NYAVP, we just celebrated our 40th anniversary last year. And we really are working our mission is to end all forms of violence within and against LGBTQ and HIV affected communities. And when we think about like that level of violence, right, and what does violence mean, a lot of the work that we're doing both is on this interpersonal level around sexual violence, around intimate partner violence, around hate violence. And the approach that we take, while recognizing, right, that these are like codified as crimes and policy, that we want to broaden the definitions of violence to make it more expansive for folks to be able to see and name their own experiences and name their experiences as violence that's happening. Being able to name not being able to have gender affirming healthcare, right, as violence, being able to name being outed at work for your HIV status or your gender identity or your sexuality as violence, as hate violence, being able to name that sexual violence looks a lot of different ways, and it includes sexual assault, and it's expansive, right? That violence for disabled communities that are queer and trans and gender nonconforming can look a lot different than sexual violence that happens for in heterosexual and cis communities. So we're really trying to work from an expansive understanding of violence while also meeting survivors where they're at in their own experiences and being survivor-centered. And I want to go back to this issue of safety, because I think what we are reckoning with right now is what does safety look like? What does safety mean for our communities? what does access to services look like? What does, in the trainings we always say, right? Like even getting people's pronouns right is like the baseline of safety, right? For LGBTQ folks and gender nonconforming folks and non-binary folks. So really looking at that question of safety and trying to interrogate it and broaden it and figure out what that means for us is a challenge that we're taking on. And then just also kind of building off Patty, what you were saying about culture and institutions really influencing interpersonal violence. That's spot on. I think that in a lot of our trainings, we kind of use this approach of the 4 I's, right? That there's oppression that's happening at the ideological level. So thinking about like white supremacy, the ideology of white supremacy, the ideology of anti-Blackness, the ideology of transphobia, trans antagonism, and how that gets institutionalized and is really hard to like see because we're all, like Patty said, like we're all in these institutions. So it's hard to see like what institutional violence can look like because we're in it so many times. And then that interacts with our interpersonal lives and our internalized lives, right? So that's how we look at violence and oppression at AVP. And as a survivor, I also have seen this play out in my own life. So yeah, that's what I say for now. And thank you for having me on this panel. It's really great.
Thank you for your answer, Erica. I think you really challenged a conventional definition of violence that we often see. And that definition often excludes the experiences of LGBTQ plus folks, especially when it comes to defining systemic or institutional violence. I'm really excited to hear that that kind of lens is incorporated into AVP's definition of safety and approach to work. So thank you again for sharing. Hema, the floor is yours.
Of course, I needed to unmute myself. Hello, my name is Hema, and I use they, them pronouns. And I'm here from the Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center. And I'm just really happy to be in community with you all today. I think a lot of folks have already sort of addressed this huge question that's been posed to us. But one of the things that I think is also really important in this conversation, and which is one of the main reasons I work at the Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center, is this idea of violence and the societal barriers that can harm a young person's livelihood. And since I work at a place that is adolescent focused, I'm always thinking about the youth who are highly marginalized. But we want to uplift all of these marginalized folks and, those who are queer and those who are young. And, I could go on and on. We want everyone to live out their best and healthiest life without those barriers, those societal barriers, and access to resources that are really important. And just to name a few of these barriers that I keep speaking of, they could be economic, they can be, from your family, at the community level as well. And as many of us know here, this can have long-term and dire consequences on the physical, emotional, and psychological sense of well-being. And so just to go back to Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center's work, we've existed for almost 50 years, and we aim to provide the least number of these barriers to access these health services, and kind of like a one-stop shop. And I hate to use that because that has also a very capitalistic notion, but what I mean by that is that someone can stop in and access the health resources, whether that's primary care resources, mental health resources, group services, more information, knowledge to sort of better their own lives. And unfortunately right now, because of the structural violence that is seen and that a lot of these panelists have spoken of, it's hard to, or rather, it's that youth and marginalized folks end up having to advocate for themselves. And I just think that that's so important, but I would hope that in the future we wouldn't need that. And at the Adolescent Health Center, if I may add, one of the other barriers about, on a personal level, is that they don't need parental permission, which can also have huge effects depending on what community you come from. And so I just wanted to highlight that as well, and just sort of uplift everything that Tanish, Erica, and Patty have already named. So thank you all.
Thank you, Emma, for sharing. I think you brought up some really important barriers to building safety, especially for younger folks. And I really appreciated hearing about how your organization centers the agency of young folks and honors their resilience, but also tries to create a safe and affirming and accepting place for them. With that, we can move on to our next group question. So, our definition of justice has evolved and is still evolving. What, in your opinion, should be a part of our definition of justice? What does this alternative definition of justice do to allow more and better access to healing for survivors? And Erica, do you feel comfortable sharing first?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I think this question is a great question. And on the AVP level, right, we are really looking to survivor-defined definitions of justice. So if for a survivor, justice means that they want to report to the police, or they want to, try and go through the criminal legal system as an organization, like, we will support them. If justice means that they need to get a restraining order, we will try and support that. If justice means that they actually want help, like, trying to figure out, like, how to rebuild their lives, and they want to figure out, like, how to rebuild, their credit score after their abuser might have, like, wrecked it, or wanted to figure out how to find shelter and safety in that, like, that, we will support them. So we're trying to be very survivor-centered in our in all of the work that we're doing, and trauma-informed as well. In that, I think that we're having a discussion both organizationally, and I know, like, in my own organizing circles, about what does it mean to be tied to a system that is very limiting in the idea of justice, so the criminal legal system, knowing that that system brings or perpetrates so much violence against LGBTQ, HIV-affected people, especially against Black and Brown, transgender, nonconforming, femmes, non-binary folks, and that the system really was made for that, right? Like, there's nothing broken about what's happening right now, and it's hard to balance that. And I think we're really having a reckoning right now as to how we're working to both support survivors and be survivor-centered in that way, and organize around these systems that are perpetrating violence in the way that they're intended. And for myself, as a survivor who I've never reported anything, and that was a choice for me, at recognizing that I would not get justice through the criminal legal system, as a Black, queer, disabled, femme person, like, I would not get justice. And I know that. And so for me, really doing this organizing work to end violence, especially in Black and Brown communities, doing organizing work to uproot systems that are perpetrating violence, doing trainings, doing being in community and lifting up joy and healing and resilience for my community. For me, that's what justice looks like. Building strong ties with people, making sure that, like we've got us. For me, that's on a personal level, what kind of some of the justice work looks like. And also recognizing that for a lot of folks, like there is no justice, right? For a lot of folks, like justice means this wouldn't have happened. Justice means that people would still be alive right now. Justice means that sexual violence wouldn't have happened. And that's hard. It's a hard thing to hold. So those are some of the things that both professionally and personally we've been reckoning with and I've been thinking about.
Wow. Thank you so much for that answer, Erica, and for sharing part of that answer as it relates to you personally. I think that was just incredibly well said and really important for all of us to hear. And I'm not even going to begin to like try to respond to some of the amazing points you made. But the last part about justice not even being something that's available to many of us, or to many folks, because right, then the harm wouldn't have happened in the first place, is something we need to, I think, remember. And the tension you bring up, which is like part of why we're having this conversation today, that like there's, as you said, like a reckoning going on right now, and acknowledging that sort of what we had set up initially, which is working just as it was set up to do, as you said, and is perpetrating violence and harm and continues to do so. There's now this tension that there has always been a tension, but we're acknowledging it. And how do we disentangle ourselves while being able to provide the justice that some people are looking for and alternatives and other options that other people might be looking for, and stopping that harm and acknowledging that harm at the same time? But you said it way more beautifully than I did. I will now ask, did we decide who should go next? No, I'm now going to ask Hema to respond if you are ready.
How do I even respond to that? Erica, really, really love that answer, and brought up a lot of thoughts for me, actually, in that we have each other. And I think that this also goes back to the idea of transitional justice. Just so many thoughts. One of the things, and on a personal level, I am the child of a Tamil refugee from Sri Lanka. And one of the things in my research when I lived in Sri Lanka was about this community accountability piece. And I was really thinking about that as well when we think about justice, not only having each other, but also just being accountable for one another, right? And it doesn't have to be, in these big terms of TJ and RJ and whatnot, but it can just be as simple as some of the everyday practices of, oh, I messed up. That can be accountability too. And sort of having less of this sense of right and wrong. And a lot of the times when I think about that right and wrong aspect, or good and bad, especially living in America, I think back to its puritanical roots in a sense. And I also think back to the state of saying, oh, you're a good person and you're a bad person. And I really just don't like that as a sense of justice. That doesn't look like justice to me. That doesn't look like justice for a lot of young folks that the Adolescent Health Center serves. I just feel really strongly about this point that if we all just started to be a little bit more self-reflective in our journeys and wherever we're at, and meet each other with a little bit of compassion and hold each other accountable, I think that would just be so beautiful. And so I'm just going to end it there, but thank you.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this celebration of community resilience and accountability. I think a lot of the definitions of justice that folks have named here can really be seen in the ways that community cares for and looks out for each other. I think you also brought up a really wonderful point, Emma, about this kind of binary model or definition of justice that we have. And I'm excited to hear other folks define what justice looks like to them. Tanish, do you feel ready to respond?
Yeah, I'm also really enjoying just listening. I mean, this conversation is so rich. So much of what Erica shared just resonates with me. You know, as as someone who identifies as a woman living in a Black body, have I ever felt like I've received justice, or that this notion of justice has been for me or people like me or from my community? And so we have a lot of work to do. I think, you know, one of my first thoughts around this is that in order for us to even be able to imagine justice, we have to feel some measure of safety. We have to feel that, you know, we are worthy of response, worthy of protection. We need space to vision that and imagine for ourselves what that looks like, and especially if you're a survivor of a crime, or if you've been harmed. And that space is not often provided. So what I love the most about the We Got Us statement is that we create that space. We always have within our communities for us to vision that and for us to define it for ourselves. And although it's really complicated because of the structures and systems that we have that are supposed to respond to us and to respond to our needs, we do have us, and we do create safety, and we do we do give each other room to think about what justice looks like in community. And so a lot of the things that Erica mentioned, those are the things that we're able to do, respond directly to the needs of people, and give space for them to define what they need for healing and for accountability, and to be able to move through their lives. And that's important. So much of the ways that we think about this conversation around justice is centered around criminal justice system. It's centered around guilt and innocence. It's centered around this thinking of protection. And, you know, I love Patty because we've had some amazing conversations about how do we vision this? Where are we going in the future when we talk about justice? And when we are imagining responses that don't center around punishment, and when accountability looks different, you know, that peace and safety doesn't look as binary, doesn't look as black and white. And so, you know, I love that in the survivor community, we're able to continue doing that with and for each other. And I think it's important that we be very intentional about continuing to create that space for us to define justice on our own terms, and remove the barriers so that we can experience it.
Thank you for highlighting the work survivors and communities have really done to define justice on their own terms, especially when systems and institutions don't serve everyone and can perpetuate harm themselves. I think that's a really important point that you brought up. And we can now pass it to Patty.
Thank you. Yeah, these are very big concepts you're throwing at us today. Well, for me, it's like, what kind of justice are we talking about? You know, are we talking about legal justice, which is, you know, also going through the criminal system, criminal justice, healing justice, transformative justice, moral justice? I like the idea of, so it's complicated, you know, but I think that we probably need to break it down when we talk about justice. You know, what kind are we talking about? What interests me is healing justice. And that involves also systems, right? Because if you are participating, whether it's in the medical system or going through the medical system or the health system or the criminal justice system as a victim survivor, or as a just as a human, you know, trying to get things right, make things right, you know, how does it land? And part of, I think, the equation that we need to look at is there's the victim survivor, then there's the harm doer, the perpetrator, the person who caused or allegedly caused the harm. we have had this binary about it. I mean, I think we're starting to break down the binary by looking at the trying to de-incarcerate and empty when we can, empty our prisons if we can, or keep them only for a very small amount of people. So I think that I think we've been tackling this. We're beginning to really unpack it, and it's complicated. It's very complicated, but I like the idea of thinking about healing justice. And so if we could have a grading so that, say, a survivor went through the court system, law enforcement court system, criminal justice system, to try to get some justice for the harm that was done to them. What about the justice that happens to that harm doer, that perpetrator? I think we have to really start thinking about that. And also maybe tackling the idea that if you go through the justice system, and if there is not some healing that goes on through that, and if it's more oppression, more harm, more trauma, then that can't be justice for the survivor. Right. So I think we're onto something about trying to come up with new definitions and, kind of find new pathways and new ways to think about what healing and what justice means. I mean, for sure, like our name of our organization is Peace Over Violence. But we know that you can't have peace if you don't have some justice. You can't have peace if you don't have some healing, and that can be from generational trauma, not just from, current trauma. So healing justice is what interests me. And how can we get there?
Thank you, Patty. And don't go away just yet, because you're getting the next question. But I think I know, get ready. You got this. I'll try to summarize for a little while first. You made some really interesting distinctions that I think are really important. I mean, I like the idea of, justice just looks so differently depending on what we're talking about. And this idea of healing justice, it made me think a little bit about what Erica said earlier around sometimes justice is like really practical things, like someone's credit score needs to be repaired or they need a place to live, right? And that can make a huge difference in someone feeling like they have access to justice. And so that can go really well into this idea of healing. And then the other distinction that's really important, I think you met, that is a whole conversation in and of itself, is this idea of justice for whom? And that when we're talking about people who cause harm and survivors and have this sort of black and white, as other folks have said, like distinction between the two and label things good and bad, that maybe we're actually doing ourselves and our community a real disservice. And that justice for people who cause harm is also an important concept and conversation for us to be having, both how they can personally achieve justice and how maybe like differing views of what justice will look like in a specific like conflict or harm can sort of like travel, can go forward. I hope that made sense. So I've got you still here, Patty. So I'm going to ask the first directed question, and it's a big one, but I'm sure you'll have a lot to say that is really interesting for us to hear. So a lot has changed in the anti-violence field over the years, including a lot of what we've talked about, our definitions of violence, justice, harm, and healing. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the lessons you've learned from being in this work for decades, 50 years at least that we know of, right? And how do you feel that society's definitions of healing and justice have also changed how that's demonstrated and done at Peace Over Violence?
What have I learned over being in this movement for 40 years at this organization, Peace Over Violence, for almost 40 years? I started as a volunteer. Well, there's been so much, I mean, the fact that we have been able to evolve to this point, to the fact we moved from trying to really make these issues of violence against women, violence against all women, including women who have disabilities, women of color. We started really with that whole intersectionality early on. And I think how that has evolved now is to really, from wanting to make those issues become serious, I think we've gotten to the point that these issues now are connecting to so many other issues, so many other social issues, that it's almost making it imperative that we change all of our institutions, that we have to change all of our institutions. When it comes to violence, there are so many intersecting causes, right? Poor educational schools, not access to health care. People have mentioned, these are violences too. You know, it's not, you're not punching somebody in the face, but these are violences too. These are cultural and institutional violences that our communities, families, individuals suffer from. And there's an intersectionality there, which I think we're trying to really connect with. And so that makes the problem to solve it much, much bigger. So I think what I've seen change, we've gone from wanting people to be aware, to understand the issues, then having them understand trauma. And then how do you deal with it? How do you deal with complex trauma? How do you deal with it? It's not just about sexual assault, but it's intergenerational trauma. It's about racism and it's about misogyny. You know, how do we deal with this as a country? And so I consider myself an evolutionary revolutionary because I don't think these things happen overnight, for sure. And I also think if you try to do something overnight and you do it really quick, you probably get it wrong. So I'm really fascinated about the paths that we're on now, we're creating, which is really movements connecting with each other is really an important part. And very specifically, I think I would say that I've learned, aside from the fact that things are complicated and things don't change overnight, but that you have to really be in it for the long haul. You just have to keep going, and with the barriers that are there, even as movements, the movement barriers, even the political backlash. You know, it's often said that when you have backlash, that's kind of it's kind of a sense that you're doing the right thing because now they're trying to stop you, right? So there's been so much that's changed in 50 years since POV was one of the first organizations of its kind in the country. And we've become influencers. We have become influencers. I'm not so sure that you can change things just from the inside, but I'm not so sure you can change things just from the outside, that it has to be a coming together. That's what's been so important about how many people who have, you know, all the feminists who went into law and really started to transform law. How many women and people of color are going into all these different professions and changing those professions, you know? So change is the name of the game. We just have to keep at it, and we have to somehow stay together and stay connected. One of the themes for Denim Day this year is, we have two themes. One is Believe Survivors, and the other is, along with We Got Us, is we protect each other. So I think along the way, that's what we have to find. We have to find our connections and maintain our connections, maintain our kindnesses, maintain our, you know, spread the love, because we're in a very big battle. It's a war. It's a war right now. And we want to make sure that we have as few casualties as possible. But it's just, you know, change is the name of the game. You can't stop it. So let's try to make it go in the right direction.
Thank you, Patty. I really appreciated hearing about the evolution that POV has gone through over the past couple of years, and how movements around sexual violence are, again, having this complicated but very, very important evolution to include different communities, different experiences, and different voices when it comes to supporting all survivors of sexual violence and other forms of violence as well. So our next question is for Tanish. Our events description has some examples of investment, redirecting police and prison and military budgets to physical and mental health care, equitable free education, sexual abuse and sexual violence education and prevention, housing programs, drug and alcohol programs that support wellness and not criminalization, as well as reproductive care. What does investing in community mean for you and for your organization?
That's a great question. We have been, our organization started in 2013 with a goal of reducing incarceration in California. We were leading mass incarceration in the country. And I've said this a couple times this week, and it's becoming definitely more and more relevant, with all of the situations that we're dealing with and responding to right now. But the conversation around divesting from jail and prisons and reducing incarceration, our organization centered survivors in that discussion, because we know that one, survivors from our communities were often left out of conversations around investments, left out of conversations around public safety, weren't considered to be survivors or given the identity of victim. Many had never even reported crimes, but had definitely been harmed. And so we recognized that many of our voices were absent in conversations around investments, where they needed to go, or even strategy and how we were going to achieve safety. And so our Crime Survivor Network has been really informing what that looks like. If we're going to achieve safety, let's center the people who have been most harmed, least helped, in defining what that looks like and where we need to shore up resources as we are scaling down and scaling back and divesting from systems that don't work for us. In this moment, especially over the past 2 years, as there's been a national movement and attention around divesting and defunding law enforcement and other entities and reinvesting those resources directly back into community. That's work that we've been leading legislatively, but also leading by supporting survivors in discussion and supporting their leadership to be able to govern where those resources go. The short answer is that we want the resources to go directly to the people who have the relationships, the people who are providing the care, the people who are responding, the people who are supporting this vision of transformative healing and justice. That's where we want it to go. And, we see our work as being an opportunity to remove barriers, whether that's legislatively, programmatically, really being able to help decision makers, but also those who hold the resources, understand what exactly we mean when we say remove the barriers so that people can get access to the support they need. So all the things you named are definitely the areas that we want to see them go to. In California, after Prop 47 and 57 passed, we've been tracking spending, and we have over $30 million that's been reinvested into trauma recovery centers in California. And those models have been expanded across the country. That's critical, because that model, what it does is it removes barriers to access for mental health, for healing support, for basic needs that survivors have, and to have someone walk with them through their healing journey and help give them access in other areas, help them navigate access to other supports that they may need. We want to see more of that. But we also want to lean in on prevention, which often gets left out of our conversations because we spend so much time and resources responding to crisis. So that's another big area that we want to see. And I think that, in this moment, while we are in a moment of reckoning in our country, but also in the survivor community, dealing with these very big themes that Patty mentioned, this notion of this shift and what does it really mean for us as we move forward, and how do we not recreate systems, but give people space and opportunity to really define healing and justice for themselves. That's where we want to see investments go. We want to see them go to preventing harm from happening in the first place. We want to see more investments in well-being. But we also want to loosen up the discretion, so many of the barriers and just beliefs that there needs to be a system of some sort governing how the resources are utilized in our community. Our communities know what they need. They have been saying for decades and generations But there's always, these additional layers that they have to push through to be able to get access to the resources. And when they do, it's very little investment. And I'll close out by saying that in California, there's a massive amount of spending that goes into the criminal justice system, and less than 1% of that spending actually goes directly to support crime victims. And so when we talk about priorities and what we want to see moving forward, we want to see investments that are not at the expense of the same communities that are being harmed. We don't want to rely on fines and fees and restitution. We don't want to have to rely on building the case for the harm, but really build the understanding of the need to invest in well-being. And so that's what we want to see more of, and more of it centered and in the hands of the people who actually have the relationships and who are directly impacted by the issues.
Thank you so much, Tanish. You are doing such amazing work. It's really great to hear all about it, and I want to hear a lot more. And I mean, one connection that I was thinking about when you were talking is this, this idea that prevention gets left out. And not to disagree with you, only to say that I think so much of the responding and intervention that you are suggesting needs to look very differently and be about investing in communities and non-carceral responses. Shifting that will lead to prevention of violence, because putting people in prison doesn't then prevent violence. I think we know the exact opposite, right? Not investing directly in the community itself and as you said, the healing, or the most harmed and the least helped, like the exactly what those folks need, right? Investing specifically on the ground to those people, those survivors, those communities, then also, even if it's a response to harm that it's happened, it's still going to prevent more harm from happening in the future. Because without that healing, without those resources accessible, those folks then might be people who either perpetrate or experience more harm later in their life. So not to say that in any way I disagree, but just that prevention is happening too in the work that you've already described. So thank you very, very much. Erica, I'm moving on to you. So our question for you, something that you already brought up, actually. We know that for some communities, some communities are significantly more impacted by violence, and specifically sexual violence. For example, as you mentioned, Black trans femmes are murdered at higher rates than anyone else in this country. So what does caring for the most harmed and most impacted survivors look like? How is your org, or would you love to center those survivors who are most impacted?
Thank you for this question. I think the first thing that I'll say is recognizing that Black folks, that Black trans women, Black trans femmes, Black trans people are not being targeted because of their identity, right? That intersectionality is not because of someone's personal identity. It's about the overlapping systems of oppression that are creating this violence that is designed to have these incredibly detrimental, negative, violent effects on people. So it's a system of trans antagonism and trans phobia. It's the systems of anti-Black racism. It's the systems of homophobia, of patriarchy, of misogyny, of ableism that are creating the conditions that we're seeing these massive, unprecedented, and wild amounts of murder that's happening and being perpetrated against Black trans femmes and Black trans women. And I think that distinction is really important because it turns it around on the system, right? It's not, I think a lot of times folks are being told, it's about someone's inherent vulnerability, that just because who you are, you're inherently vulnerable. And that's not true. It's because of the society that we're in, right? And so in order to stand up for and stand with and protect and yeah, just take care of folks who are in that. So Black folks, Black trans folks, undocumented folks, disabled folks, you know, we can list on, but it means that we need to uproot the systems. And it means that we need to see people, as like inherently human beings with inherent dignity and brilliance and value, which is why I love disability justice so much. And I use that as a lens and been trying to incorporate that as a lens into AVP's work, because they're like being able to create spaces and create communities where folks are being able to be seen for who they are, and where folks are able to have needs. We all have needs. It's not a bad thing to have needs, right? That need to be met. Everyone has strengths. Everyone could cause harm or be on the receiving end of harm. All of those things need to be recognized and held in community. I think following the lead of the most affected folks, so following the lead of Black trans women, there are Black trans women doing incredible, amazing work around this country, from like the Marsha P. Johnson Institute, Trans Latinx Network, like there are folks doing amazing work. And we need to be amplifying those voices instead of trying to say what our solutions are. And I think we also, in that we don't need more allies, right? Like you can't, being an ally is not a noun, it's a verb. And we actually need more people to be accomplices and to be in this with us. And what that looks like is like interrogating your own transphobia, right? It looks like calling people out and not being afraid to be like, actually you misgendered this person and I'm gonna need you to stop. Or you made this comment and that's actually not okay, regardless of whether there's a trans person in the vicinity of the conversation, in your life, whatever, which I'm 100% sure, whether someone's out or not, folks know someone who is trans or LGBTQ or HIV affected. Yeah, so I think for me, that's a lot of what it looks like to be an accomplice. That's a lot of what it looks like to be in community with and center and amplify, because it should come from a place of like genuine love, right? Like we're not trying to save anyone. We're not trying to like give people power that they have. Like it really should come from recognizing someone else's humanity and realizing that like our humanity is tied together. And so that's what we have to do. The very last thing I'll say is also more on the like panel, on the policy side, is like look into policies that are happening nationally and at the local level, like the Arkansas bill that's banning trans affirming care. Like that is, to Hema's point too, like that's affecting trans kids, like youth, right? Like looking at how these things are then affecting like people's interpersonal lives, right? And internalized lives and things like that. So really like being aware of those policies that are coming out and fighting against them as well is really important. That's it, that's all I'll say.
Thank you so much, Erica, for that really, really wonderful answer. I think you named a lot of isms that are really integral to the foundations of the systems and the institutions we see today. What you said about sort of this assumption around vulnerability with the experiences of marginalized folks, I think that really stood out to me. And what you shared really shifted the accountability back onto the institutions and the systems and these big structures that are the ones causing harm and perpetuating harm in the first place. I hope folks feel called to be an accomplice and to challenge their own definition of allyship. So our next question is for Hema. So Hema, as a preventionist, how does reimagining healing and reimagining justice work to prevent violence too?
Thank you so much. I just want to also uplift the comments that are, or the responses from the panelists from Tanish, from Erica, about investing in the people, right? And to me, prevention is in the people, right? Prevention, as a definition, to me also responds to the little things, the little harms that happen in a daily life, so that we won't need so much on the direct services side. And so that we can also just, once again, to repeat this, be accountable to one another, build that community love that we all probably hope to see. Now, there's also this aspect, I think, in prevention where folks think that, okay, well, I'm learning about all these things and this is right and this is wrong. But I just think that if we lean into some of those uncomfortable moments where we ourselves are uncomfortable, do a little bit of self-reflection, actually a lot of bit of self-reflection, if I'm honest, and just sort of try to not think of things as right or wrong, but how can I make this a more loving and beautiful society? How can I, and going to Patty's point, how can we heal survivors and heal folks? I think that a lot of folks, and especially marginalized, populations. And when I think about that, I think definitely about the intersectionality, youth, people of color, youth and people of color, low-income youth, LGBTQ folks, and Black trans folks. I mean, the list goes on, right? There's just so much harm here. And I think that prevention is really the key in addressing a lot of that harm before it gets to a bigger problem, right? And we won't see so many people with trauma if we do that prevention piece. Maybe even if we do that prevention aspect as well, we won't even need these systems anymore, right? Because we'll be also connected to one another, and that we don't need the buzzwords of TJ or RJ as well. I think that, and I'm going to get a little personal here and I'll try to make it short, but I come from a background where as I mentioned, I'm Tamil, and my father taught at an HBCU for over 30 years and taught me so much about the roots of community organizing, how non-Black identity folks can also build solidarity, not necessarily allyship, right? Going back to Erica's point, and how we can sort of learn from one another and learn in this community organizing aspect. And that to me is also part of prevention. It doesn't need to be so formal. So that's kind of my thoughts around prevention. And I just want to end with prevention is life. Hashtag that now.
You made me laugh, Hema. But I love that because prevention is all the time, right? It doesn't stop. It's not something you think about in particular moments or when something's already happened, right? So I love this new hashtag to add to our Denim Day campaign for 2021. And I just think, like you said, connecting to the way Erica described the need for accomplices and not allies, right? And that prevention and being an accomplice is much more active, even if it's the little things as you described, than it is just sort of like being aware. Yeah. Okay. That was amazing. Thank you all so much for answering these specific questions. We are going to go to the Q&A from the onlookers, from the people watching us on our live stream. And so far, we have one so far, and it's not directed at anyone. So anyone who feels like they want to answer, I encourage you please to do so. So this question is, how can feminist organizations and this current iteration of the anti-violence movement stop relying on and uplifting law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Something we've been talking about is a really important question with very important answers. Does anyone feel like they want to start? No big deal. How do we trash everything and start over? Oh, we have Patty and then Erica. Is that okay?
Yeah, this is a
Right.
huge question of the day, right? Of the moment that we're in. But one of the things that where I'm at with it right now is we have to have them take the back seat in the whole evolution of our feminist, of anti-violence against women movement, and now it's an anti-violence movement because we've been, we've connected more. Is that it's been too predominant. I mean, I think there may be a role in certain situations, but I think we could start now because we do have these relationships. These institutions exist, these practices exist, where we have to start having law enforcement just keep receding, taking the back seat. And it has to, I do believe that the community-based organizations, the ones that have been around for a while, new ones that are propping up, should be up front. They should be the prime movers, and law enforcement should be in the background for those rare occasions, hopefully, when it's necessary. So that's just the way I'm thinking about it now. And it happened the opposite way. When we wanted to have all these issues, so sexual assault, all the issues be taken seriously, we almost had to push and say, these are crimes, remember? You're not treating it as a crime. This isn't fair to the survivors who are surviving these crimes or victimized by these crimes. You're not taking it seriously enough. So what happened in that taking it seriously was this whole progression that I think everybody on this panel knows about. It became predominant. It became almost like a runaway train. And there's a lot of politics in there and why that happened. So I think that part of right now in terms of beginning implementation of making change is they got to take the back seat in the caboose.
Erica, did you want to go ahead, or did anyone? Yeah, I'll let you go first. That makes sense.
Cool, no problem. Yeah, I think that it's a hard conversation with a relatively, it's our conversation, but I think that I firmly believe the answer is defunding the police, and that, like, when we say defunding the police, we actually mean that, and that defunding and thinking about, like, how are we divesting from law enforcement? Like, how are we training people to be upstanders and bystanders in situations? How are we training people to respond to violence in ways that don't involve the police? How are we, and it's larger than the police, right? Like, I'm sure, like Hema at a medical institution, right? Like, there's mandatory reporting, there is child welfare services, there are so many different systems, right, that are policing Black and brown people, and especially queer, trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary folks, undocumented folks, sex workers. And I think when we are thinking about how are we divesting from that, we have to think about all of the tentacles of the criminal legal system and the prison industrial complex. And I think it's a hard conversation because in reality, it means that sometimes organizations that get federal funding, for example, it means that maybe those organizations in 15, 20, 30 years actually aren't going to exist, or are going to have to exist differently, because we're not taking DOJ money, because we're not taking like OVS money, right? Because we're trying to do things that are actually promoting safety and not in these systems that we know perpetrate violence, and that we know that like teachers and social workers in some instances, because, and bartenders, right? Like have more de-escalation techniques and tactics than police. And I think that it's interesting. Like, yes, I think that I don't want to discount a lot of the amazing like work that's happened in so many years. And I think that even looking back in the 70s and 80s and thinking about Black feminists, the anti-rape movement that was happening, folks who were really calling on structural changes and a choice that was made to center crimes and to center particularly white, upper middle class, cis het women in that. And I think, and we're looking at the consequences of that now. And I think being really real about that is something we have to face with, like love and respect and understanding and learning. But it's real and it's there.
Thank you, Erica. I really appreciate that perspective. And I think in this conversation, I've been thinking a lot about just what you said, right? And how, I mean, I don't remember the exact wording of the question that we were asked, but what do we do if we don't use the criminal legal system? And I think when we think about someone who looks like me, for example, right, like that my experience is just not going to be anyone else's experience, and that is not okay. And I wanted to use more strong language than that. And more than that, right? It's more than not okay. It's like, I just want to think a little bit about Patty's response and how it needs to take a back seat and challenge that a little bit to say that like a backseat isn't enough when those systems are still actively causing harm, which I think we've all acknowledged in this conversation. And so like, we can't continue to uplift any system if sure, it helps some people, but for most it's not available or it's hurting them. So I guess this conversation just needs more. And I'm going to pass it to Hema, who I think also wanted to respond.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. And, I want to really uplift also some of Erica's sentiments and repeat some of the stuff I had also said maybe a little bit more clearly, which is, I think that we don't even need these systems in the future if we had more community accountability, right? That if we are taking these things as a backseat, right? The systems, institutions, if they take more of that backseat, push them all the way, erase them, please. Exactly. I think that when we think about multiple industrial complexes, we like to think about, the nonprofit industrial complex, right? The medical industry, the list goes on. All of these could disappear if we, started to work one another, building that accountability. But see, here's the thing about accountability, right? The thing about accountability, it also requires self-reflection, right? To say, okay, why am I feeling defensive? Why am I feeling a certain way? Undoing white supremacy aspects, right? That perfectionism, the defensiveness, it's let's hold each other. That's really where healing is, in my opinion. But I think that we could throw all of these systems out in essence if we became more accountable with each other. And that's the way a lot of POC folks all around the world have done it for years. And I think with just a little bit of compassion, love, and a little bit of knowledge, and empathy. And I'm not talking about the empathy of, nobody's ever going to understand my experience. I'm not going to understand other people's experiences. We all come with our own journeys and experiences, right? But empathy in the sense of, I know what it feels like to be defensive. I know what it feels like to feel sad. I think that these are really important aspects. And screw capitalism as well for disengaging us on our feelings. But I think if we also return to those roots, we would also have more community accountability and less of these systems, and put the nonprofit industry out of business, put everything out of business, and let's just be on earth again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hema, and thank you, Erica. I think both of you really highlighted like that we don't need these systems that pretend to protect us, because they were never really rooted in protecting us in the first place. And you've challenged that definition of us, like who is being protected. And I don't know, it feels like those alternatives to safety and to accountability already exist. And it might be a matter of just investing in building those authentic connections and having time to reflect. And I don't know, I'm frustrated that we don't get the time to reflect and to do that work with ourselves and with each other. So kind of, again, on that note of thinking about these alternatives and highlighting the work that communities are doing, our second question to the group is, are there any alternative models that are currently being used by organizations and communities to intervene and respond to sexual violence?
Is it okay if I go?
Absolutely.
Great. I'm sorry to take up so much space today, but I did want to quickly add that, when we think about alternative forms, I just really love Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center. And I'm sorry, I just, even though we're talking about systems, I really, really love that place, because I feel like it really challenges the need for, needing the systems really, but just serving survivors at its very basic level, without parental need, without parental permission. If I had had that in Ohio, we might have a whole different story today. But what I mean by that is that removing those barriers are really important. And I think that it's also not an alternative form where, a lot of the providers that are at the Adolescent Health Center, they really believe the young folks. And that's just that, and I wish we could do the same for all survivors as well. So I just wanted to add that, and thank you.
Can I piggyback off that real quick?
Yes, yes.
I really invite folks who are watching to read The Revolution Starts at Home. It's a really awesome book written and edited by women of color, mostly queer. And one of the stories when I was getting into organizing work that I always carry with me, and also Color of Violence is also a great book too. I'm actually forgetting which book it's from, but anyways, it's a story of an organization that Alexis Pauline Gumbs started in Durham, Raleigh, North Carolina, Ubuntu. And it really was, or is, this group of women, femmes, who came together and were like, you know what, we are not going to allow sexual violence or intimate partner violence to happen in this community. And one of the things that happened was there was a woman who had children, and her husband was a police officer and he was abusive. And she went to this group and was like, I experienced this violence. I don't feel like I can turn to the police because of my husband. And B, I need a safe place to figure out what I want. And so the community, got together and found, her safe housing with her kids, and tapped other men in the community to talk to the husband and be like, hey, this is not okay, right? And gave her space, like Tanish was talking about before, like gave her space to figure out what she wanted to do and how she wanted to figure out the harm that she experienced. And what she really wanted was she wanted her kids to have a relationship with their father. She didn't want to take that away, but she personally did not want to have a relationship with him anymore, and he needed to change. And so they had accountability groups and so many different conversations, and like just things like there was always someone with her at parent-teacher conferences, so it wasn't just him and her together. There was always someone with her when she was dropping off the kids or picking up the kids or things like that. And I just like hold that story so much of like, wow, like this is a story of a survivor getting what she needed, of an abuser not being denied their humanity, and also being offered a chance to take accountability and being, and changing in some ways. I don't know exactly like how much or whatever, but it's an offering, and I hold on to that a lot. That this work can be done, and there are some models for it, and also want to vision and keep dreaming about it.
Did anyone else want to respond to that question, or shall we move on? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Erica, for ending on that beautiful note of visioning and dreaming. And I really appreciate all the times that we've been highlighting that caring for each other and compassion and love are ways to achieve all of these goals in healing and justice that we're reimagining today. So our final question is for the whole group. And I want to mention that Tanish actually had to hop off. They didn't disappear, and that's why we haven't heard from her again. I'm sorry. But they are just very busy investing in communities like they've described. So we really appreciate her time. So the closing group question for everyone, I will let whoever wants to go first, go first. In a world where we have reimagined healing and we have reimagined justice, what does that future look like and feel like for survivors? Does anyone want to take it on? More dreaming and visioning, I think. It's for everyone.
I mean,
Thank you, Erica.
Okay.
You all will. So thank you for volunteering.
Yeah, I love this question. I think that, it means that my immediate thought was like, people get to breathe, right? Like people will be able to be expansive, and survivors will be able to be playful and creative and dream and live in that safety. And I feel it. I think about, Black kids will be able to grow up, and mothers will stop having to have these conversations about, what do you do when police are pulling you over, right? Like Black girls will be able to be protected and loved. Transgender, non-conforming, non-binary folks will be able to just be them full selves without having to worry about being their full selves, like I just feel like there's so much joy and so much expansiveness and so much just creativity that is possible, right? And I find a lot of that in, Octavia Butler and, like Black feminist future writing. And that really is what gives me hope, because like it's hard out here now. And I know that like there were my ancestors that dreamed me up to be here. So I want to keep working and fighting to dream up someone else, so that they could be here in the future. That's it.
Thank you, Erica. Is it okay if we hear from Patty next? How the future looks and feels for survivors. Awesome.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Erica. I also loved what Erica said about humanity tied together earlier. It's like, to me, that's what would be happening. There would be much less separation. There would be much less incarceration. Children would not be separated from their parents. And the idea that there'll be much less stigmatization and bias and lies and mythology told about survivors and their experiences. And if something did happen, the hurt would be attended to in every system. And the concept that hurt people would really be something taken seriously. And there would be, everyone would be about wanting to do less harm. And if harm happened, to help healing without doing more harm.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Hema, your last but not least.
I just want to say thank you to everyone who's here today. Want to really uplift both what Patty had mentioned about, more harm. Harm people, harm other people, right? And that's so key in the work that we do. So it's really important that we have this compassionate love, as Patty uplifted Erica too, right? And I just want to end with, I just feel so deeply thankful to be in community. And I hope that our future looks like marginalized survivors. And who I mean by that is all those intersections we talked about today, that they don't feel afraid to speak their truth, where they don't feel like it's a taboo, where people won't judge each other, that we all just, really sit in this community love with one another. And that's kind of how I envision reimagine justice and healing. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing to everyone. I've really enjoyed getting to hear from your individual perspectives and to explore this world of joy, of laughter, of justice, and of healing together. I did want to take a moment and correct a statement that I had made earlier during my moment of silence. We send love and healing to the son, the girlfriend, family, and loved ones of Dante Wright. Before we close out, I did want to highlight there are some resources in the description of the YouTube video, and there's also a website where you can look for more resources and more information about some of the things we've talked today. And that website is denimdayinfo.org/reimagining.
Thank you, Sanjana, and thank you to all of our panelists, our interpreters, all of the logistics folks behind the scenes. Very, very helpful. You have no idea how much work goes into this. It was so wonderful to hear from each one of you. Denim Day New York City is also trying to be a year-round organization, and we have a lot of events right now, of course, for Sexual Assault and Sexual Violence Awareness Month. So you can look those up at denimday.nyc. And very exciting to me is our second annual virtual Bicoastal Denim Day Rally, which is in 2 weeks, again on Wednesday, April 28th. And that one is at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time. and will also be live streamed on the Peace Over Violence YouTube page. So I hope you all will join us for that virtual survivor rally and this new tradition we've started with Peace Over Violence, who we're so happy to partner with. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful night.